So this is Pacific Fury. It's a 4-game turn game of the Guadalcanal campaign, and it starts right after the initial battle. The Americans have landed, the Japanese have launched their light naval counterattack. So it doesn't deal with the first Japanese surprise attack, which damaged the American light fleet so much. It starts right after that. Both players are now in the mode of, okay, everybody knows what's going on, what the forces involved are. In the middle of the map, obviously there's Guadalcanal, and you'll see sea areas defined by white lines around it. There's only 4 playable sea areas. Ones that are kind of grayed out are unplayable. All there is Eastern Solomons, South Pacific Ocean, Iron Bottom Sound, and the slot. This is a 4-area game, which I initially saw and didn't think anybody could make a design with a 4-area game, but it is, and it works. So numbers on the ship counters, that's its firepower. And it's a die rolling system, best played with a bunch of multicolored dice. And number on it is you have to roll that number or lower to hit. So if you have a 4 on your carrier, it has to roll a 1 to 4. There's a little bit of a twist here. If you roll under, you get that number of hits. So if you roll on a 4, if you roll 1, you get 1 hit. On a 4, if you roll 2, you get 2 hits. On a 4, if you roll 3, you get 4 hits. 4, you roll a 4, you get 4 hits. 5 or 6, you miss. So the best die roll for combat is as high as possible without exceeding the value. Little anchors on the ship represent armor value, how hard the thing is to sink. And we'll get into that a little bit later when we get some hits on some ships. There are, on the aircraft carriers, you'll see little planes, 1 or 2. That represents the amount of combat air patrol the carrier can put up, and which will take away the potential of hits. There's an initiative track next to Guadalcanal Island. It's got an airfield marker in the middle of it. That represents Henderson Field. Every turn that Henderson Field is not damaged by the Japanese will go 1 box to the right, representing the Americans expanding the airfield and making it more and more effective. If the Japanese damage the airfield by like a shore bombardment, the airfield doesn't go up that turn, it just stays in whatever position. Also, if the Japanese damage the airfield can't defend itself with app, and it can't strike an enemy carrier. Finally, the point of the game is to get Japanese troops onto the island, and if you have suppressed the airfield that turn, and you land troops on the island, you push the airfield track, the track labeled initiative track, toward the Japanese flag on the left-hand side. And the Japanese, once they are in the 1 or 2 box, the Japanese colored boxes, they are considered to have owned the airfield. They're flying planes from it. And the situation reverses. The Americans are trying to land more troops, take the airfield back from the Japanese. So this is a game that says basically sea control, including air control, sea air control decided the Battle of Guadalcanal. Whichever side could control the supply and could land troops is going to ultimately control the airfield. Any questions so far? Okay. The first thing players do each turn would be roll for an event, but there's no event rolled on the first turn. And random events are only rolled by the player who is behind. In other words, it represents the guy who's losing deciding he needs to commit more assets. So you don't have that on turn one. So the next thing we do, this is the core of the game, is we make task forces and we put it on the operation box display, the displays with the little flags. Each side is going to do 7 operations in a turn, and in an operation, you can only move a task force from the operation box to the map, following the little arrows. Or if you've got somebody on the map, you can move it one map area. So since there's 7, we'll call them operations, impulses in other games, there are only 7 impulses. You can't make more than 3 or 4 task forces and then carry out a plan. The other tricky part here is when you make these task forces at the beginning of the turn, you are committed to enter them into the map in that order. You have to make an operational plan for the month, and then after you make that operational plan for the month, you can't switch it. So what do I mean by an operational plan? So for example, Japanese have to set up on their display first, representing the Americans' superior intelligence. The Japanese ships would be placed on the operation display face down. All the Americans can see is the size of the stack, the number of the stacks. So let me play with the Japanese here, and I'm going to play with spread the ships about so you can see it. The Americans have 3 aircraft carriers to start with: the Wasp, Enterprise, the Saratoga. Japanese know that. Japanese decide they're going to start with a carrier strike force. They have 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku, Zuikaku, 2 light carriers, the Ryu, Zuihu. Pardon my inability to pronounce things properly. So I'm going to put these guys in a task force. Since we're playing solo, everything's face up, since I'm playing solo with myself, but the American player wouldn't see this. A carrier task force needs escort with it, and every surface ship you send with it contributes 1 AA point. And any aircraft helps negate some of the enemy strike power, and the little planes on the deck of the carrier represent the strike power. So not the chance of hit, but just the amount of planes in the air. So I know that the American carriers can launch 6 planes. So if I want maximum cover, I have to match that number. I have to have 6 escorts. So I'm going to max it out. I don't want the Americans to have more planes than I have escort. And that's a good carrier task force. 6 cruisers, 4 carriers. And all the Americans would see would be a stack of 10 ships. I'm going to follow up for my second operation, being a surface strike group. I am going to try to bombard Guadalcanal. And I'm going to commit a couple of battleships, and a couple of battle cruisers, a couple of cruisers. Then I'm going to make a third group, which has a couple of battle cruisers, a bunch of heavy cruisers. Then I have 2 transports. Each transport I get to the island successfully and move that marker 1. I also have the Tokyo Express, which I'm not using right now, which is destroyer transports. If I use those during a turn, I have to give away one of the slow transports. Destroyer transports can only come down the slot, and you'll see there's wording at the end of the little arrows. They only be used by Task Force Bombardment, Tokyo Express. They're the only ones who can go to the slot. If a task force has a carrier in it, it's automatically a carrier task force. And a carrier task force cannot contain a transport. The carrier task forces have to go to the Eastern Solomons for the Japanese. Then they can maneuver from there to the South Pacific. The carriers for the Japanese and the Americans can only be in the South Pacific and Eastern Solomon. They cannot be in Iron Bottom Sound or the slot. Either side wanted to take carriers into restricted waters. They want room to maneuver a carrier task force. So carriers can only go in Eastern Solomon, South Pacific. The Japanese transports can only go Eastern Solomons, South Pacific, and Iron Bottom Sound. They can't run the slot. They're too slow. Only destroyer transports can do that. At this point, the Japanese have made a rough plan, and they've set their guys up. Americans now look at that, and they know the Japanese could start with surface group coming down the slot. They could start with a carrier group. They don't know what's gonna happen. The Americans are going to move first. It's going to alternate movement. The Americans decide that they're uncertain what the Japanese are going to do, and they're going to split their forces a little differently than the Japanese. They're going to send one cruiser in the first zone. And they're going to send that guy. Their plan is to send it right to Iron Bottom Sound and just set up a patrol in Iron Bottom Sound to fight anything that comes into it. Or why that is a halfway decent strategy. They're going to send Wasp, Enterprise, and Saratoga, the second group, and they're going to assign 6 escorts because, again, the Japanese have 6 little planes on their carriers, and they don't want, if you do not have enough escort, they have more planes than you have escort, they add 1 to their hit die roll. If their planes outnumber your escort by 2 to 1 or more, add 2 to their hit die roll. So they overwhelm the anti-aircraft in the combat, and that's a bad idea. I'm going to make a heavy service group. I'm going to finish with 1 cruiser. The Americans don't have transports right now because they own the island. They've got the Marine Division on there. So both sides have made their initial plan. Questions at this point?
Roger, are there normally some dummy counters so that you don't know exactly what someone might be doing on the other side?
Oh, the only way you can dummy in this game is one of 2 ways. You can, like, for example, the Tokyo Express has to be a single task force by itself. It can't be with other ships. So, like, I remember I was playing a few years ago with Mark Simonich. Even got the ship here to show it. I sent the Maya by itself, face down, he can't see it, into the slot. Mark looked at it and goes, oh, I know what that is. That's the Tokyo Express coming down the slot. Mark had a pretty good task force, I'll make it this stack for play, in Guadalcanal, and Mark ran up the slot with his guys. Fortunately, the real Japanese invasion was out here in the Eastern Solomons. Mark fought a cruiser. Japanese came in and landed behind him and took the island, and he goes, ooh, that wasn't a very good plan, was it? So you have to commit at least a real ship or a couple of real ships, at least cruiser level things. There's no dummies representing things that aren't ships. You have to use some vessels. Any other questions? Okay, it would be first American action from the American base Espiritu Santo. You can go right to Iron Bottom Sound. It says may only used by the U.S. Navy player when he has the initiative. The Americans have the initiative. They send the cruiser Australia, their ally, to the island. And the Americans move their marker. That shows they've done the first operation. Japanese choice. You can always pass an operation, and all of your guys just go one box up the track. The Japanese are on the offense. Move their carriers to the Eastern Solomon. That's their first operation. Now, the Americans suspect that is a carrier operation because it's out in the Eastern Solomon. But they do not know that for certain. Japanese could have chosen to send a surface group out there as either as a decoy, or they're sending some slow transports, a surface group out there, and hoping to sneak them in like I did against Mark. So it's indicative but not certain what is out there. Americans activate their second group, and it's a carrier group, and it goes to the South Pacific. You can either move, carriers can attack one zone away, it costs them their move. So it's Japanese second move now. They've got a carrier group out here in the Eastern Solomons, and they have to decide. Do they target the big force of Americans in the South Pacific? Do they target Guadalcanal itself and try to knock out the airfield? Combat is 2 rounds. If their carrier force is strong enough that if they knock out the airfield in Guadalcanal, they could use the second round to knock out the Australia. After you have combat, after you attack something in this game, you go back to base. You've used your fuel, ammo, bombs. That's it. That was your major operation for the month. So the Japanese are looking at this and going, they'd like to work on Guadalcanal, but they're afraid that the Americans might be on their flank there in the South Pacific. So they decide in this circumstance, they're going to strike the Americans in the South Pacific. The moment they decide that, both sides' task forces are revealed. There's no hiding anymore. That represents the time to scout, and you're committed in this direction. If there was more than one task force of Americans out there, they'd have to choose a task force. They'd have to guess. In this case, both players have decided to go for massed carrier. They haven't split their carrier. They're going for a major carrier combat here. Combat is simultaneous. This is not a midway. The battles around Guadalcanal were more even in the damage both ways, and both sides will roll. The Americans have 3 carriers, each worth 4. Japanese have enough anti-aircraft, so no modifier for that. And then you subtract, you're going to roll for hits. Because the Japanese have a combat air patrol of 2, you're going to subtract 2 from the number of hits. If the Saratoga rolls a 4, Saratoga would get 2 hits on the Japanese. But the combat air patrol can never reduce the hits below 1. So if the Saratoga rolls a 1, 2, or 3, it's going to get 1 hit. Rolls a 4, it's going to get 2 hits. And the hits are not on specific ships. They're apportioned at the end of the battle. Normally, I say I would grab a bunch of dice, but the vessel module is not quite as smart. So I'm going to roll for the Saratoga. Rolled a 2, which will be 1 hit. Enterprise, on hit. 5 for the Wasp is a miss. The Americans have 2 hits to put on the Japanese forces, and we'll just go through the damage routine right now. It's simultaneously, so it doesn't make any difference who does theirs first. So now you compare the hits you're putting on them to the armor value. The Americans have a decision to make. If they put a hit on somebody, they don't sink him, he's damaged. And the Japanese are out for 2 months when they take damage. If the Americans take a hit, they come back the very next turn. Damage control and repair being a lot better. So the Japanese want to generally sink carriers. Americans are happier to damage them. But sometimes even in the middle of a turn, because of the tactical situation, it might be okay for the Japanese to damage them. So the Americans look at it and they're going to put 1 hit on each of the 2 big carriers. When they do that, they have to roll for damage. If your number of hits you're putting is less than the armor value, only a 6 will sink the ship, a critical hit. Because each of these have Zukaku and Shokaku have 2 damage, the Americans will only sink them on a 6. If they put both hits on 1 carrier, the Shokaku or Zuikaku, then they would have a number of hits equal to the armor. 4, 5, or 6 would sink the ship. If you put hits greater than the armor value, 2 to 6 sinks the ship. So like the Ryuhu here has no armor whatsoever. The Americans put 1 hit on it. Anything but a 1 sinks the ship. The Americans are going for the fleet carriers, so we're going to go for the Zuikaku first. Roll a 1, which is just damage, and then the other one, Shokaku, you roll a 2, which is just damage. The 2 Japanese fleet carriers are damaged, going to be heading for back, and we would just put them on months ahead on the turn record track. The Japanese haven't rolled their attacks. They had 2 fleet carriers, so they have 2 rolls for 4. Rolled a 4. Would normally be 4 hits, but the American Combat Air Patrol having 2 planes on a carrier, you check for the best carrier in the task force, and that's with 2 little planes. That reduces it to 2 hits. They still managed 2 hits out of 1 carrier. That was a great die roll. Next carrier, the next fleet carrier, that's 1 hit. That's 3. 2 light carriers each roll. The Japanese managed 4 hits. 2 fleet carriers, 1 got 2. Second fleet carrier got 1. One of the light carriers got 1. So now they look at it and go, what do we want with 4 hits? They're going to put 2 hits on the Wasp. But the Wasp only has 1 armor value. They're going to put 2 hits on the Enterprise. Wasp with only 1 armor is going to sink on anything but a 1 right now. So let's roll the Wasp's damage. Wasp is feeling really, really fortunate. However, this is a little exception. If 2 hits were put on an American ship rather than 1 hit, it does take too much to repair. So Japanese put enough hits that the Wasp is going to take some damage. Enterprise, I think I got that right. Let me make sure. It's been a while since I did that. Yep, I got that right. That's the other reason why I decided to go 2 hits. It's going to give me a 50-50 chance of sinking the Enterprise at 4, 5, or 6, and it's also going to take the American carrier out for 2 turns. Enterprise, thanks. There is no dead box in this game. So So any particular place you want is always a good spot for it. Japanese will put them up here. But we've completed one round of combat, and any damaged or sunk ships are taken out at this point. After a round of combat, both sides have the decision as to whether they want to fight a second round of combat. The Americans look at the situation and go, this isn't good. Because we're fighting two enemy light carriers. We've got one. And if the Americans leave right now, they go back to base. The Japanese carriers can use their second attack on Guadalcanal. So the Americans are deciding whether to fight also to protect the island. And they decide to stick around, and the Japanese are going to stick around. Questions at that point?
Yeah, I have a quick one. If the Japanese had decided instead of fighting a carrier battle, would they have attacked Guadalcanal and then just been able to get away without the Americans getting to strike their task force?
That is correct. So that would have represented the Japanese, rather than moving in within range of the South Pacific force, just going and attacking from north of Guadalcanal. They wouldn't have met. So if the Americans had wanted to prevent that, they could have led with their carrier force, gone to the South Pacific. They could have moved to the Eastern Solomons. And then when the Japanese came out of their truck box, it would have been waiting for the Japanese in the Eastern Solomons. And when the two task forces had moved into the same area, it would have automatically created combat. So if you block an enemy's path of movement, that's one way to guarantee an interception. With the exception of surface forces. Surface forces can only fight in the slot in Guadalcanal. It will not. If two surface forces encounter out in the Eastern Solomons or South Pacific, too much empty ocean. They can't force an engagement. They'll detect each other. The two sides' speeds are so close and everything that whoever didn't want to engage wasn't going to be engaged. So there's no giant Jutland-like surface battles unless it's Guadalcanal, Iron Bottom Sound, or the slot. So anyway, in this case, though, since the Americans hadn't led with their carriers, they weren't in position to block the Japanese. So it's going to go to a second round of combat. Saratoga is going to roll. Doesn't get any hits. Two Japanese are going to roll. 2 and 5. Japanese got 1 hit. As the Combat Air Patrol Saratoga reduced it to 1. Japanese rolled damage on the Saratoga. They don't do, they needed a 6 to sink it. So since they only put 1 hit, this goes to next turn. Really didn't do anything. Moral victory for the Japanese, but nothing else. It'll be back next turn. The attacking Japanese are done. They've used their group. Their group goes home. Goes back to truck. As they have been used in combat. Defender normally is also used in combat, but he has to take at least 1 hit. If the attackers attack a defending task force and do no damage whatsoever, defending task force stays on the board active and able to move and attack later turns. So in this case, both sides did enough damage to each other. So the American cruisers, no more mission to do, they leave. Okay. Japanese chose to use their carriers, which were on the board. So their task forces that were on the display went 1 up the display. Because they used a guy on the board, and you could only move a task force on from the display pass or use somebody from the map. So think about it as using up time in the operation. These other task forces were waiting for the carrier battle to clear the path. And it's worked out for the Japanese so far. It's going to be the third American thing. They could move the Australia. They can bring on a new task force, a new surface task force. And they're going to bring on a new surface task force to Guadalcanal. They're going to bring on it. Now, because they know the Japanese have only 4 carriers, they know the Japanese are not going to be able to airstrike Guadalcanal this turn. Because the Japanese have no carriers left. So they know that now any action that's going to happen the rest of the turn is going to be surface to surface. So they're just piling some ships into Iron Bottom Sound now. Japanese go with their third operation. They go down the slot. Americans look at it and say, we've got enough ships at Guadalcanal. We're going to push the Salt Lake City back. Why are the Americans holding on to one cruiser? Because if everybody else gets sunk, and they send a guy to Iron Bottom Sound, they can guarantee that at least one round of combat the Salt Lake City takes. And that will take some pressure off the island. So it's a sacrificial cruiser in this case, but they're holding back a reserve that way. Sea control was critical around Guadalcanal, Iron Bottom Sound, and the Americans consistently sent small task forces piecemeal into Guadalcanal at night
I timed it. It took me about less than 30 minutes.
Yeah,
fight the Japanese often at inferior odds, because if they could keep the Japanese from supplying the island, or they could keep the Japanese from bombarding the island, even at the expense of destroyers and cruisers, that was winning the strategic goal, and the game shows that. So it's the next Japanese impulse, Impulse 4. They're going to push their transports back. And for the 4th operation, they're going to send their guys from the slot into Iron Bottom Sound. All Allied task forces, even if they didn't start as one task force, in Iron Bottom Sound only, fight as one task force. I'm going to spread them out just so everybody can see what's going on here. The Americans have 3 battleships, the North Carolina, South Dakota, and Washington. They have 4 American heavy cruisers, and they have the Australian cruiser, the Australia. And the Japanese have 2 battleships, 2 battle cruisers, 2 cruisers. It works like carrier combat, except there's no combat air patrol to reduce our potential hits. So if the Washington rolls a 3, it'll generate 3 hits. Rolls a 2, 2 hits, 1 hit. And I'll just start with the Washington. Washington missed with a 6. South Dakota got 1 hit. North Carolina. Yes, American battleships must be having like electrical problems, like historical on the South Dakota. We have 5 Allied cruisers, all with a 1, so we just roll 5 times. Cruisers got 2 hits. They made up for the battleships. The Japanese have 3 hits against them. And the Americans are going to put them on the heaviest Japanese ships they can hit. They're not really getting... Love to sink them, but really want to drive them off because the Japanese have the superior firepower. So, Nagato and the Mutsu will get damage rolls. The only way the Americans can sink them is with a 6, a critical hit. Go Mutsu. Oh my goodness. Payback. The Mutsu just blows up. Giant explosion. We'll put him down.
Oh, wow. He's a
Here
big
is
dog.
the thing. And the Americans have 2 more, so they say, well, let's try that with the Nagato. Now, Nagato is out 2 turns, but he's surviving. Then we'll put one on
It looks
the
like they're getting a free
Aruna here.
refrigerator.
They're getting refrigerated.
He's 2 turns
I
out.
thought they also got a dishwasher too.
We fought
Yeah, good.
the American half of the combat, but we have to do the Japanese. We had 2 3s, 2 big Japanese battleships. One of them got 2 hits. One of them missed. The 2 2s for the Japanese. Miss. This. A couple of 1s. So the Japanese managed 2 hits. So they're going to put them on the South Dakota and the Washington. South Dakota has the best armor. But still with a 6, you got a critical hit, and he blows up. So they're going to try to pay back. At 4, no, and then the Washington, 1. So those guys each only had 1 hit, so they're only out 1 turn. We finished a round of combat. At this point, the Japanese see no reason to stick around. Both sides have taken losses, so both sides automatically have to return to port. The Japanese because they were the attackers, Americans because they've taken damage. Japanese can't bombard the airfield as long as an American task force is in Iron Bottom Sound. And the Americans aren't going to withdraw because they have the superior fleet. The Japanese break off the action, just head back to Iron Bottom Sound. The Americans, with nothing left to do, go back to Espiritu Santo, same way. And that looks like on that surface engagement, the Americans really got the best of it. Sunk a battleship, damaged another battleship, and they took light damage to 2 of theirs. So, questions there on surface combat?
Very interesting that Mutsu blew up, since that's exactly what happened to her in the Truk Harbor in 1943. A pure coincidence, but it's kind of interesting.
The Enterprise being sunk, though, doesn't really fit that narrative. But hey.
Oh, that didn't recreate history. Let me ask you a question. You've probably already said this, and I may be rude here. But destroyers. So destroyers are intrinsic within the other units.
Right.
So sometimes, they operated independently, particularly for the Japanese and the Tokyo Express. So I'm just wondering, how well do you think it's handled?
He's trying to do month-long turns. It's not trying to be, the destroyer blue on picket duty by itself, for example, that kind of stuff. Oh, I think it handles the major battles of the Guadalcanal campaign correctly, the major reinforcements and everything else. It's not trying to show, like I said, 4 destroyer sweep that beats a light Japanese light cruiser and a couple of destroyers. He's trying to show it at what he feels were the strategic engagements, the ones that actually had a chance to move the needle, so to speak. So it's not a tactical game in that sense of the Guadalcanal campaign. It's a strategic, operational, more accurate. It's an operational game of Guadalcanal. So at this point, it's the Americans move, and they're going to move 5. They're going to send their Salt Lake City out. The Americans now have sea superiority as the only thing. Now, Japanese do 5. As long as they've got the slow transports, they can't go down the slot. They have to go to the Eastern Solomons. So they go to the Eastern Solomons. Americans on move 6 are just going to pass. sitting right where they want. Japanese on 6 go in. Now here's the problem for the Japanese. It takes 1 round to fight the Salt Lake City. And I'm going to play it like I do golf. I'm going to give the Japanese a mulligan rather than rolling 7 1s and 2 2s. I'm going to say the Salt Lake City sinks. For purposes of demonstration. It shouldn't survive that engagement. We'll give them a die roll to see what the Salt Lake City does back. Missed. But in 1 round, Japanese should take the Salt Lake City out in 1 round of combat. The next round of combat, you have to bombard the airfield. The hits go the same way as naval combat. So the 2 2s would roll, got 1 hit. It's in the 0 box. It only takes 1 hit to suppress it. It gets up to 2 and it flips over to red X. Henderson Field is not operational now. So they came in at night, sunk the Salt Lake City, they knocked out Henderson Field. Landing troops takes a round also. There's only 2 combat rounds. Transports do not have enough time now to unload. They do not have a 3rd round. So the Salt Lake City sacrifice and then the time needed to bombard Guadalcanal meant that the transports did not arrive. The Japanese just have to return base. They just ran out of time for what they were trying, time, fuel, whatever you want to think about it. And they go home. And that was the first turn of Pacific Theory. Check at the end of the turn, the airfield was damaged, so it doesn't go up toward the Americans. The Japanese landed no troops. It doesn't go toward the Japanese. At the end of each turn, the airfield is repaired. The CBs repair the airfield. And we're right back where we started last game turn. Nothing has changed in terms of victory. Just a bunch of ships went to the damage and sink pile. So, any questions on how that first turn went?
Roger, why wouldn't the Japanese task force that was in Iron Bottom Sound get to stay there if there was nobody left from the U.S.?
Oh, you always go back at the end of the month. At the end of the month, you return. A better way to think about this is none of the Japanese task forces or American task forces, the heavy task forces, ever spent more than a couple of days in the combat zone. They were always in and out.
But didn't they still have a 7th move for this turn?
So the Japanese have no forces left. So everything is returned to base, and the Americans have no forces. So they would have a 7th move, but there's no forces left. So,
Oh, I thought they could stay there till the 7th turn, then do their 7th turn, and then return at the end of the 7th. So that's not.
If they had not fought any combat, if the Japanese had not attacked, that is correct. If they had not attacked, they could have stayed to the 7th round and then gone home. But when you enter a zone with another ship, if your surface ships enter the slot or Iron Bottom Sound and there's surface ships there, it generates a combat. It's automatic. The only force that can avoid combat is the Tokyo Express can enter Iron Bottom Sound and it rolls a detection roll. And that's the only sneak force that can actually pull that off. The Tokyo Express has a chance of landing troops on the island, even if the airfield is functional, and even if the Allies have naval units there. So they do have a chance to do it just like the historical Japanese did.
Okay,
So-
gotcha, thanks.
At this point, Japanese player does not have the initiative. The 0 box tie initiative, tie goes to the Americans. The Japanese are behind in the game. They don't have the initiative, so they're going to roll on the Imperial Japanese Navy event table. And this is going to be something that the High Command back in Tokyo, Yokohama, I don't even know where the Japanese Navy where the headquarters was. Somebody's a better history guy will tell me. They're going to roll a die and say, we're going to send you some strategic help because you seem to be struggling. Roll a 4. Release the reserve. In the Japanese reserve box, the battleship Yamato, the Hio, and the Junyo. Now, some people at this point at conventions go, the Yamato never went to Guadalcanal. It's a yes and no answer. Yamato was sent to Truk. The Japanese lacked the nerve, shall we say, to ever commit it. They were planning on it, and they never pulled the trigger and set it down the slot. You, as the player, though, get the fun of being able to do it if you want. So you don't have to make that same Japanese decision. And you got 2 more light carriers, which is good because the Japanese carrier force is looking pretty sad right now.
So, Roger, one more question about the combat thing. So, am I correct that if there were 0 hits in an air battle, then the defender doesn't have to leave for the turn, but if there are 0 hits in a ship-to-ship combat, all the ships do go home? That's the difference between the 2 combats?
Oh, same rule. The Japanese had sent a couple of light ships down the slot, and they'd met that bigger American surface force with the battleships and everything. If the Americans had blown away the Japanese without taking a hit, they would have remained there. The Japanese have a strategic problem. They have to send enough force in a surface force to force the Americans to withdraw. If they don't, they can lose their force and do nothing. So it's the same for both. Defender will stand his ground unless he takes at least 1 hit. So, Americans get their carriers back, turn 2, get the Saratoga back, and they get a reinforcement, the Hornet. The Americans here have 2 aircraft carriers. Japanese have 4 light carriers. Japanese decide they don't like this whole way the last turn went. They're going to plan a different style operation, and they're going to split their carriers. They're going to split the Junyo and Ryuhu as one group. They're going to split the other 2 as a second group. They know the Americans only have 2 carriers and only 4 planes on the decks of the carriers, so they can cut their escort down to 4 surface ships and still have a maximum flak. They're going to do that. This, even though I'm going it real fast, this is the real key to the game. What is your plan for the turn? The Japanese are going to then send a heavy surface group. And then they're going to send the Tokyo Express. They're going to leave transports in Truk, or they can use them as dummies. I'm going to put 2 of them out here, face down, making the Americans think there's another task force out there. Americans are doing okay, but they took some losses there in the Washington, the Enterprise, and the Salt Lake City. They
Hey, Roger,
have a
did you
tough-
say? I'm sorry, Roger. Did you say something about losing a transport if you decided to use the Tokyo Express? Was that something you said at the beginning?
Yeah, that's right. You have to. You can't use both transports if you're using the Tokyo Express. It's a trade-off. So technically, it'd be like that. He'd be in truck. Also, if the Japanese lose a transport in surface combat, it shifts the initiative track one toward the Americans, or for air combat. If they lose a transport, it shifts the initiative. In surface combat, you can only target a transport if you've got more ships than the enemy. So the Japanese, if they're ever using the slow transports, make sure it's with a pretty big escort, or make certain you've got the balls to risk it, because it can be it can be sneaky to make it look like it's not an invasion group, to send it nearly naked, but it's dangerous. Can the loss of an infantry division, let's say, and all that amphibious transport, it goes over very poorly back in Japan. So I'm going to look at this, and my Americans are going to put both carriers in the first box. We're going to lead with carriers this time. They know the Japanese have a maximum of 4 planes, so they don't have to put as much escort either. They don't have any fleet carriers. And they're going to follow with a surface group. They could follow with a surface group that was really light and figure, well, we'll put just a couple of ships in Guadalcanal, and then the Japanese big heavy surface group could fight that guy. Danger is, yes, the Japanese would fight and go home, but if you're so weak that the Japanese finish you off in one round, in the second round they can bombard the airfield. So the Americans are always weighing, is it enough to strategically protect the airfield? I'm going to give the North Carolina free support. I'm going to give myself a couple of cruisers. Like that. And they're the Japanese. The Americans are deployed 4 task forces. Again, their goal is to try to maintain sea control around Guadalcanal. But they're dividing themselves, which is not necessarily the best option tactically. The other option for the Americans would be fighting a couple of big task forces and then just accept that the Japanese might move the initiative marker by 1. That's an option sometimes. Take the month off, so to speak. After the plan's made, Americans make the first move, send their carriers to the South Pacific, because that's the only place carriers can go from the American base. Japanese make their first move. They go to the Eastern Solomons. Americans have a choice now. Americans can strike their carrier force. Americans can move from the South Pacific into the Eastern Solomons. They'll do the same thing. It'll create combat. Or the Americans can move task force from the operation box to Iron Bottom Sound. And Americans are going to move to Iron Bottom Sound. It could have struck the Eastern Solomons, but they don't know what the Japanese task force is. They know if they attack, they go home. They only have 2 carriers this month. So they're going to adopt a wait and see. And they also know that the Japanese have got a lot of task forces on the display, and they've only got 7 operations. So don't help your opponent, in this case by attacking. Make him carry out the complicated plan. So I'm going to make the Japanese move and attack. So the Japanese are going to activate the task force in the Eastern Solomons. All their other task forces go one box up track. You can see, looking at the Japanese track, wait a moment, they're going to have a problem here. If they move guys onto the board and do something with them, they're going to push that last transport past box 7. That means it never comes in the month's plan. If the Japanese plan, and it can happen to the Americans too, but it's usually Japanese. If the Japanese plan is too convoluted, think the plan of Midway, too many task forces trying to do too much, you will then end up with not getting it all pulled off if your opponent doesn't bail you out by engaging you early. So the American player is saying, no, we've had our code breakers working on it, and we think the Japanese have a complicated plan here that's going to take them a lot of time, and we're going to sit and wait for it to come to us. The Japanese now, in their second move, are going to activate their light carrier task force. They are going to strike South Pacific. They figure it's probably American carriers. If it's not, they figure if it's a dummy group of surface force, they still figure it's a big enough surface force that it's worthwhile attacking. The carrier force attacks the surface force. That was a U.S. surface force out there. The carriers roll and the surface force just takes hits. There's no fighting surface against the carriers. It's just you're a target. So in this case, it's carrier on carrier again. Both sides have adequate escort, so the Americans are going to roll 2 dice, each one with a value of 4. Rolled a 3. This has changed from the first battle. The Japanese only have 1 plane on each flight deck. They only have a combat air patrol of 1, which means they reduce hits by 1. So we'll call that the Hornet. Hornet rolled 3, which is 3 hits. The Japanese combat air patrol is only worth 1. That is worth 2 hits. So that's a good American die roll. I've got 2 hits. Roll the Saratoga. That is 4 hits minus 1 for combat air patrol. Americans have rolled 5 hits on the Japanese here. So this is smelling kind of Midway-like. I'll put 2 hits on each of the light Japanese carriers. Once you go over the armor value, there's no point piling extra hits on it. It doesn't do anything. They'll put 1 hit on a light cruiser, a heavy cruiser. The 2 Japanese carriers are only going to survive on a 6 and on a 1. Junyo first. 6. Hio blows up spectacularly. And we'll go the Tony. Revenge for Pearl Harbor here. Tone took 1 hit, which was equal to his armor value of 1. He sunk. So the Japanese lost to... We'll put him right underneath the Americans. It'll be easier to see that way. Japanese lost a heavy cruiser. They lost 2 carriers. All sunk out of the battle. Forgot to put the Washington. I mean, the Washington blew it. He's going to come back. He's in that task force. Oops. Turn 2. Okay, the Japanese carriers rolled back. They had a 3. They got 3 hits, minus 2 because the Americans have 2 planes on the carrier, 2 little plane icons. So they got 1 hit. The Japanese light carriers could get a maximum of 1 hit against an American fleet carrier. The other one missed. So the Japanese got 1 hit. Put it on the Hornet. Have to roll a 6. Oh my God. A Hornet blows up with a critical hit and what looked like a disaster battle for the Japanese now becomes totally different. Japanese cruisers do nothing. There's no point for them to stay for a second round of a carrier battle. They're just a target for the Saratoga. Saratoga has no Japanese targets. They were the defender. The defender can only defend himself, so Saratoga goes home, having light carriers and lost the Hornet. Any questions on that combat? Okay. It's the third American activation now, and the Americans look and say, we're not being challenged in Iron Bottom Sound, and we don't want all of our ships to be driven out at one time. We're going to pass. We're going to hold a reserve. We're not going to go for one giant battle. We're fighting for the island's control. Japanese go and do number 3 now. It's carriers again, so it goes out to the Eastern Solomon. Americans know the Japanese have carriers, and they smell this battle plan completely now. They know that that task force is undoubtedly carrier task force. Their surface fleet cannot go in the Eastern Solomons and engage it. They can't catch it. There's no surface battle except in fought in Iron Bottom Sound. So the bad news here is they just have to sit there and take it. They're going to wait. And so they're going to pass again. They don't want to send more targets to Iron Bottom Sound. So they just wait. Japanese in turn 4 are going to activate their carriers, which means everybody else on their display goes up 1 level. Again, waiting for the carriers to do their job. The Japanese goal here is to do 2 things with their 2 combat phases. One is to attack the island. Second is to inflict at least 1 step on the surface group and drive the surface group back to port. Tough job for 2 light carriers. They're going to start by attacking the airfield. If the American airfield was in the 1, 2, or 3 box, it would have functioning aircraft that it could fight and strike the carriers back. But it doesn't. It's in the 0 box, so it's not able yet to handle aircraft. So 2 rolls for a 2. 1, 2. Both Japanese carriers hit the airfield and they flattened it. The Japanese could retire after 1 round. You see, obviously, no reason to. They're going to target the surface force. The American surface force could also leave right now. They could say, we don't want to be around here. They're going to gamble and hope the Japanese can't generate 1 hit. If they don't generate 1 hit, they're going to still be sitting in Guadalcanal. Japanese roll 2 times for a 2. Roll a 1, a 6. The Japanese rolled a hit. American plan has failed. The Japanese target the North Carolina. They seem to be on a critical hit roll fest. Roll a 5. Only out 1 turn. He only took 1 hit. He's American. 3 other American cruisers go home. Japanese carrier group goes home. Any questions? Well, I think you can see here how the Japanese plan is coming together. Excuse me? Okay, that's okay. Oh, it's American phase. It's the American fifth phase. They send more guys to Guadalcanal. They say, well, that was very impressive, Japan, but we're still here. Japanese send number 5 on the slot. Here's the Japanese problem now. What do? Do they go into Guadalcanal, or do they enter the Tokyo Express? Problem is, if they go into Guadalcanal, this will be their 5th. They'll have just enough time for the Tokyo Express to go 6 and 7. So they decide, okay, we counted it out. We have enough time this month. We'll finish it off. We go 5. Well, no, they went 5. Yeah, they went 5 in. Into the slot. 5 goes into the slot. The Americans go 6. They're going to hold off on their cruiser. Now the Japanese have got a problem. They go in for surface combat. It will be number 6. They'll never get the Tokyo Express there because the Tokyo Express will come on 7 and it'll reach the slot. It'll never reach Guadalcanal. So the Japanese, by going into that number of task forces, a little better tactically against the Americans, but now they've got a choice. If they go in for the combat, they'll be potentially reducing the American surface strength for future turns. And that has a lot of value. But they don't get to land on the island. So Japanese are actually going to, in turn 6, all right, that's going to be a pain in the butt. Doesn't work either way. Okay, we'll show you something here. If the Japanese come down with the slot with the Tokyo Express, Americans for their last move could go into the slot. Because the Japanese are in 2 task forces, the Tokyo Express by itself, Americans can choose which ones to engage. So they'll shoot up the Tokyo Express. The only way the Japanese will get through is if they survive 2 rounds against the South Dakota, the Washington, and those 2 cruisers. The likelihood of the Americans missing all of those die rolls is almost 0. The Japanese decide, screw it, it's not going to work. Americans have outfoxed us by going into 4 task forces. It was the right counter move. So we're going to go for a surface battle just to punish them for their impudence. Americans, knowing this, will fight 1 round, and whatever survives will take off unless the Washington and South Dakota roll real well. The Washington will roll a 3, misses with a 6. The South Dakota is a 3, hits with a 1. New Orleans, Northampton. Americans got 1 hit. They will put it on the Yamato. See if they can blow up the Yamato with a critical hit. Yamato was better built than a lot of Japanese ships, but still was definitely susceptible to a critical hit. Almost happened. Instead, it goes out for 2 turns. And then the Japanese would roll the Yamato back. The 2s. Japanese roll a lot of 5s. Got 1 and then 6 1s. Japanese got 2 hits. They're going to put them both on the Washington and see if they can 50-50 sink it. 4, 5, or 6. Sunk the Washington. Americans see no strategic purpose in standing around. They go back home. Japanese go back home. This is Japanese Operation 6, which pushed the Tokyo Express to 7. And there's nothing that can happen here in the 7th impulse. The Americans could go to Guadalcanal, run around. Japanese with the Tokyo Express can get to the slot. We've run out of time for the month. That's the end of turn 2. Initiative doesn't go either way. The Japanese didn't land on the island, but the Japanese did suppress the island, so it just flipped. So far, this is an indecisive Guadalcanal campaign with just a lot of bloodshed on both sides. Questions? All right, we'd start turn 3. Turn 3, the Japanese still do not have the initiative. It's the American initiative. If the initiative were to change, the roles would be reversed. The Americans make their task forces first. They would get the transports. They'd be trying to land on the island. But the Americans are holding the initiative. So the Japanese roll again for an event. It's a bomber offensive. For any of you who have the game, this is a difference between the Japanese version and the second edition of the Revolution version. First 300 games that we produced of this game, the Japanese map, the Japanese counters, and the map had the table on it. There was no bomber offensive. There were only 2 Japanese events, torpedo hits or reserve. We lowered the reserve and put the bomber offensive in to represent the Japanese bombing attempts to suppress Henderson Field. If you roll the 6, the bomber offensive is successful, and you flip the airfield right from the start of the turn. This is a pretty good deal for the Japanese, because now they don't have to worry about bombarding the airfield. It's taken care of for the turn. Each event can only happen once. You can only have 1 bomber offensive, 1 reserve, 1 torpedo hit. So, at the moment, the airfield is suppressed, and Japanese feel a lot better about their chances. Americans, on the other hand, get some replacements on turn 3. They're getting the North Carolina and the Wasp back. Japanese are getting their fleet carriers back.
So if you had rolled reserves on this turn, the Japanese would have gotten no advantage for being behind. Is that correct?
Oh, question. Just reroll again. They have to get an event. The high command is going to do something to help you. You would have gotten either submarine torpedo hits. That's what the torpedo hits means, or bomber offensive. And the torpedo hits also represent destroyer action. So Japanese were going to get some help because so far the Americans are holding them off and winning the game. So, the question. At this point, I really don't know what the heck. Everything the Japanese do has come to naught. They're going to lead with the Tokyo Express. They're then going to take all their carriers together, look at the American carriers and see that they have 4 American aircraft, so I know how much escort to send to carriers. I'm going to send a lot of guys. I'm going to use a transport and a cruiser in the last one. So I've got the airfield suppressed. I'm going to try to sneak troops quickly down the slot on destroyer transports first thing. The Americans look at it and they go, is that a Tokyo Express or is that what I described I did to Mark Simonich? Is that a heavy cruiser pretending? And I don't know. But I am going to send 4 cruisers in the first group, carriers in the second group, I'm going to go like that. I'm hoping that 4 cruisers is big enough that if it is the Tokyo Express and I choose to intercept, it'll be good. So Americans go first. They spend operation number 1 going to Guadalcanal. Japanese have no choice to go first, and the Tokyo Express always goes down here. So I had to commit to Tokyo Express. Didn't have a choice. Americans now have option number 2. You can wait back at Guadalcanal. Problem is the Tokyo Express is only intercepted on a die roll of 1 if Henderson Field is not operating. It's intercepted on a die roll of 1 or 2 if Henderson Field is functional. I don't like those odds. Waiting back at Guadalcanal is a poor way to intercept the Tokyo Express, so I spend my second operation, move everybody else up the track, use my second operation to come up here. In this case, going up the slot, I will intercept the Tokyo Express, but I've only got 1s to hit him. If I don't hit him, there's nothing back at Guadalcanal. There will be no interception whatsoever, and the Japanese will land the troops there. I'll talk about the one optional rule in the game. Tokyo Express has no combat value, just a marker. It's actually a debatable point. And the destroyers were full of fuel and troops. Were they really incapable of any combat? Probably not. This represents a pretty good flotilla. I've had people make good arguments either way. As an optional rule, you could give the Tokyo Express a combat value of 1. We're going to play it straight up the original game. The Tokyo Express is just going to take hits. The Americans are going to roll 4 cruisers for 1. Did not hit. Tokyo Express says we're not going to go away after 1 round. The American cruisers aren't going to go away after 1 round, so it's 4 more times. Americans have rolled 8 times for a 1 and missed. My theory that a little more than the average result would be adequate has failed. The American cruisers go home having expended a lot of ammo, a night engagement, the destroyers by them. So in the second move, the Japanese second operation, Japanese are going to move everything up 1 because they're moving guy on the board. Tokyo Express gets to Guadalcanal, it moves the marker 1 in the Japanese favor. At the end of this turn, the Japanese player will own Guadalcanal. They have successfully landed troops on the island. And because the Americans had never gotten the box farther to the right, Marines were on the island right on the margin the whole time, and the Japanese have managed to do the job. Questions at this point? At this point, Japanese declare the turn over. They're not doing anything for the rest of the turn. The island is theirs. All the rest of their operations were planned to bombard or drive off American naval. There is no purpose anymore in any of the Japanese planned operations. And of course, if the Japanese say, we're not doing anything, what are the Americans going to do? Airfield is suppressed. They don't have any transports or troops locked up. So imagine this is, in real life, this is what happens when the initiative shifts, something happens. Now the Americans are having to make plans to retake the island. So the third turn is over. At the end of the third turn, flip the airfield, functional. We're going to get the guys in the damage box, which is the motto. The Japanese player is now the initiative player, and they will be moving first. The American player will be planning his task forces first. But the Americans do get to roll on the random event table because the Japanese have the initiative. So they're going to roll. Okay. It says Imperial Japanese Navy overestimate. This is the equivalent of Midway. It says that a carrier that the Japanese thought was sunk, surprise, it's been repaired at Pearl Harbor. And the Enterprise, true to history, has actually survived this point to the war, and the Enterprise rejoins the fight. So, oops, that was a surprise. Now the Americans have 3 carriers. They're going second. They have 2 transports. This is going to be really hard on the Americans with this situation. Really hard. The problem here for the Americans is they haven't really done that much damage to the Japanese. They have, this is a little bit of light losses for this game, at this point in the game. And it's going to be tough. So the Japanese see the Americans form into 3 groups. They know the Americans have to land out of transports. They have no equivalent of the Tokyo Express. And they know they have to clear them first. So the Japanese are going to make 2 carrier task forces to start, because carriers can stop a surface group pretty easy. Nothing shocking about saying that. And they're going to make a surface group with the Yamato. And the Nagato. Big battleships. And they'll make a 4th group. I don't think a 4th group is really even... Not with the American plan, a 4th group isn't really worth anything. All right, we've got a battle plan. The Japanese move first. They go out to the Eastern Solomons. Americans move their first group. They go out to the South Pacific Ocean. Now, I mentioned earlier that the defending side could stall and see if they could run the enemy out of operations if their plan was too complicated. Americans only have 3 groups. The Japanese look at that and say that's not going to be the plan. Also, the Japanese don't want the Americans in the South Pacific to swipe at Guadalcanal right now and hit the airfield. Make their job so they can land easier. So the Japanese are going to immediately carrier strike. Whoop. Transport got in there by accident. They're going to immediately strike the American task force. The danger for the Japanese here is they're the attacker. If they don't get any hits, the American task force is going to stay in the South Pacific Ocean and attack Guadalcanal, the Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal. So, Japanese are going to roll their 4. Got 3 hits, but the Americans have 2 planes on one of their carriers. It goes by the best carrier. They got 1 hit. Little guy rolls, misses. So, Japanese got 1 hit. Put it on the Wasp. It's a 50-50 chance of sinking it, 4, 5, or 6. Didn't. Wasp is damaged, but it survives. So it's out here waiting for the next turn that'll never happen. Americans roll their 2 carriers. 5. They miss. It's a disaster. The Americans declare as the defender that they're going to stand. Japanese attack again with a 4 and a 2. Or first, miss. Enterprise strikes back. Enterprise gets a hit. Put it on the Japanese fleet carrier, hoping for a 6. 5, the Japanese would be out 2 turns. It's insignificant. There are no victory points for ships lost. Go at it, guys. You lose the whole fleet. Only thing you're fighting for is control of the island. So, that's why it's called Iron Bottom Sound. So, both sides move to force on. Japanese, that was their second operation when they attacked, so they had to move up 1. The Americans get their second operation. They go out. Japanese get their third operation. Go out. Americans get their third operation. They're going to use the carriers on the board. And the American carrier has a tough job. Americans have any chance of winning the game here, he has to do 2 things. He has to put a hit on the Japanese carriers and a hit on Guadalcanal. He can choose to sequence them however he wants, so he's going to attack Guadalcanal first. Saratoga rolls with a 4. Puts 3 hits on Guadalcanal. He flips it. Notice Guadalcanal has a 1. He has a 1 airplane symbol. So actually, his cap reduced the losses to 2 hits. And the Japanese can attack back with a 1. We've never seen the Americans get the airfield up to functional. Japanese are. If they roll a 1, they put a hit on the Saratoga. Miss. Guadalcanal's done. Saratoga attacks the other task force. Needs a 1 to 4 roll. Gets a 4. The Saratoga here is awesome. That's 4 hits minus 2 for the enemy cap. He's going to put 1 hit on each Japanese carrier. Carrier first. The carrier is just out damaged. That carrier will sink on a 4, 5, or 6. Zuihu sinks. Okaku is damaged and out for 2 turns. Japanese had a 4 and a 2 coming back. Fleet carrier first. That's 2 hits on the Saratoga. Light carrier misses. Saratoga rolls for damage. 4, 5, or 6 will sink him. Saratoga goes down. Cruisers get away home on both sides. Any questions in either of those combats yet? All right. So
Is it?
at this point, Japanese go to Iron Bottom Sound.
Right.
This point, Americans go to Iron Bottom Sound. And you have the final battle.
Don't the Americans have to go to the South Pacific first because they don't have the initiative?
It's very tasty. You want your own bowl?
Correct.
No.
Technically, what happened was the Japanese would go to Iron Bottom Sound and just wait for them there. Then, in the next activation, the Americans would go from the South Pacific to Guadalcanal. So they do end up there, but you're right. Good eye. I just forgot I was getting to the final battle, but it doesn't.
So good.
Would it have made more
Maybe
sense for the
Italian.
Japanese to go after them in the South Pacific to make sure they never got a chance to be in Guadalcanal?
Remember, in the South Pacific and the Eastern Solomons, you cannot have surface combat. The areas are too big to force a surface combat. So
Gotcha.
you can only force a surface engagement in the slot or Iron Bottom Sound. So, matter of fact, that's why I'm certain if any of you guys are naval buffs in here, probably know up through World War II, almost every naval engagement in history before carrier strikes was within a short distance of land, like 100 miles. The record up until then was a French Revolutionary battle, the glorious 1st of June, where the British managed to intercept a French fleet 400 feet out, 400 miles out in the Atlantic.
Mizithra.
That was just almost unheard of, that you actually managed to locate enemy fleet and do that, even with boat planes and everything else. We never had even in World War II, surface battles happened close to land, and so that's how this game shows it. Anyway, this final battle, in real life, Americans would never fight it. They would at this point, Emmett and the boys would say, we tried to fight for Guadalcanal, we lost the fight for Guadalcanal. There's too much strength here. The Americans would have to, right now, to win this battle,
Don't put too much because it
you have
gets
to
very
drive
salty.
every Japanese ship
That's not
off
flavor.
Iron Bottom Sound in the first round of combat, and then land the transports in the second round of combat. Because if the battle goes to 2 rounds, transports can't land. If it's 2 rounds of naval combat, there's no time to land the transports. So, really, you're going to have to roll the most spectacular die roll. The North Carolina and the South Dakota are each going to have to roll like 3 hits. And then the other guys each roll a hit, that's 11 hits. Can't even do it. There's 12 Japanese targets. It is mathematically impossible for the Americans to win this battle, clear the Japanese fleet out of the way for their transports to land. So, they do have the airfield suppressed. The Japanese will not increase to the 2 box. But this battle ends a marginal Japanese victory in the 1 box, with the Guadalcanal going over to the Japanese. And like I say, there would be no purpose for the Americans to sacrifice the North Carolina, the South Carolina, and these cruisers in such an unequal fight against 4 battle cruisers and a couple of battleships and heavy cruisers. So I'm going to declare that an over. Up here in the corner, I'm going to display the losses. This is a light loss game for this game. This is the lightest losses I've ever seen in Pacific Fury. I'm not exactly certain why, but that's it. 3 Japanese light carriers, 2 American fleet carriers, an American battleship, a Japanese battleship, and a heavy cruiser on each side. And so that's it. And questions on the overall game at this point?
Hey, Roger, I just wanted to thank you. You explained games really well. I enjoyed both your presentations this weekend. Thanks so much for teaching.
That's kind of a new experience teaching on a virtual convention.
No,
I
still
teach
got
at
more.
conventions a lot, but usually with only 1 or 2 people, and a little more interaction than the occasional question. So it's kind of difficult. I thank you guys for all being patient. I hope that all made sense, and you could see how the game recreates the strategy of the Guadalcanal. And like I say, each time when you're making your battle plan for the turn, there's a lot more options that I didn't possibly show, in terms of, since I was showing both sides, I wasn't being particularly sneaky. I didn't try to pretend that a cruiser was the Tokyo Express, or I didn't send a surface group out to like the Eastern Solomons and let the enemy carrier strike it. You can do that. If you know he's got a carrier group out there, you can send a group of 6 or 7 ships out there and say he's showing a tendency to always strike at range. Fine. I'll lose a couple of ships, maybe even a couple of valuable ships, but his carriers are done for the turn and had to return to base. So there are some more deceptions you can use.